Hello everybody, Carlos Sainz was scintillating, Mercedes were massacred, and Tsunoda ruined Ricciardo this weekend in Australia. So I ask you for your hottest takes from the 2024 Australian Grand Prix, and let's have a little chat about them, because it was an eventful race, if not the most exciting race that we've seen ever. In case you missed it, this was how the 20 drivers stacked up by the end. There's probably a few drivers a little bit out of place that you weren't expecting, but Carlos Sainz took the victory in the Ferrari. It does feel like whenever Max Verstappen falls, Carlos Sainz is there to pick up the pieces. Charles Leclerc then made it a Ferrari 1-2 in second place. Lando Norris getting on the podium for the first time in a McLaren car, the first McLaren podium this year, after many people were expecting them to be right towards the top end of the grid. We've got Oscar Piastri in fourth place, Sergio Perez in fifth, Lance Stroll in sixth, Yuki Tsunoda, the surprise package, in seventh place, being that best of the rest driver. Fernando Alonso drops to eighth place. We'll talk about that a little bit later on, but some of you will have noticed that he's dropped a couple of places since the final race standings were announced. Then Nico Hulkenberg is in ninth place, and then Kevin Magnussen in 10th place. That's right, both Haas cars in the points. How wrong we were about Haas at the beginning of this season. Alex Albon in 11th place for Williams just misses out on points in a very controversial weekend for the Williams team. Daniel Ricciardo in 12th place. Actually, not too bad a finish for Daniel Ricciardo, but we'll get into why he was maybe a little bit higher up than he really should have been. Pierre Gasly finishing in 13th place. Both of the stake cars in 14th and 15th. Not a good weekend for them once again. We'll talk about them in a bit more detail. Esteban Ocon was in 16th place, and he was the final finisher, with George Russell dropping out on the penultimate lap of the Grand Prix. Although, was it his fault? Wasn't it his fault? It's a bit 50-50. It depends on which side of the argument you want to fall upon. Then we had Lewis Hamilton retire early in the Grand Prix. I think it was lap 17 of the Grand Prix. Lewis Hamilton came to a stop with an engine failure. Max Verstappen, his rear right brake failed on lap 3 of the Grand Prix, and we'll talk about the ramifications for that in Red Bull, and Max Verstappen dropping out of this Grand Prix, losing another winning streak to Carlos Sainz, and of course Logan Sargent, the Williams that did not start. Well, Alex Albon started using Logan Sargent's car, but Logan Sargent didn't manage to race himself this weekend. And let's delve into it then. Your hot takes for this weekend. I'm going to start with a hot take of my own, because I just felt like we couldn't start anywhere else but with Carlos Sainz. I personally feel like Carlos Sainz has earned the right to be a number one in a big team that actually builds the car around him. Because what a sensational year for Carlos Sainz it has been so far. You look at Bahrain, he turned up, got that podium finish, and was clearly the closest battle to Red Bull. Okay, you could say Charles Leclerc had some issues. There were definitely things that went in his favour, but he managed to do it. Then he misses out on the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. He isn't able to take part, has to have his appendix out 2 weeks ago, and then comes back into it and absolutely flies. And let's not forget, this is a Carlos Sainz who started off this season being sacked by Ferrari, and knowing that he has to spend an entire year with this Ferrari team that, you know, like him, I think they enjoy having Carlos Sainz within the team, but they don't want his services anymore once it gets to 2025, because Lewis Hamilton has become available and they want to get the Mercedes driver, the 7-time world champion, into that second Ferrari seat. And you can understand why, and we'll delve into that a little bit later on when we talk about Lewis Hamilton's race that didn't really happen, and another weekend where the Mercedes just fell apart. But for Carlos Sainz, it's got to be pretty heart-wrenching that he is the driver delivering wins for Ferrari right now. He was the only Ferrari driver to get a win in 2022. He's the first Ferrari driver to get a win in 2023 as well. 2023 and 2024, I mean. And he just delivers every single weekend. As I said, that podium in Bahrain, now this podium, and I just felt like, you know, everyone's, oh, Max Verstappen just dominates these Grand Prix. Carlos Sainz is absolutely flying. He dominated this Grand Prix. Everyone was like, oh, Max Verstappen has dropped out of the race. Maybe we're going to see a little bit of a battle. No, Carlos Sainz made it his race and just flew through the pack and into the lead of the race and just decimated everyone that was behind him. Mr. Pulse has absolutely named it. Carlos Sainz is in the form of his life right now. And then outperforming his teammate Charles Leclerc in this way, just like in Singapore, picking up the pieces when Max Verstappen's misfortune does come into his favour. He's just, I feel like, got to the point in his career where realistically he should have a car that is built around him. I know that Charles Leclerc is the Ferrari star boy. He is Ferrari through and through. He's come through their academy and he is their man. But at the same time, it just feels like Carlos Sainz has everything required of a driver to really battle for a championship if he had a car that was there for him. And it's so difficult, right? Because he's had such an up and down trajectory to get here. He was in Toro Rosso and he didn't quite outperform Max Verstappen. Max Verstappen was the young shining light in Red Bull, and of course he's gone on to be a 3-time world champion, so you can understand Red Bull kind of picking Max Verstappen over Sainz. Then you look at the fact he went to Renault and was eventually displaced by Daniel Ricciardo, and that kind of situation. He didn't want to be the second and ended up going to McLaren, and it was, again, just Renault maybe missing out on a really solid driver in Carlos Sainz. I don't think he did anything necessarily wrong while he was at Renault, just ended up getting moved on. Then he goes to McLaren. I think he was the main man at McLaren, but then Lando Norris, again, a McLaren graduate. The team wanting to maybe build around Lando Norris for the foreseeable future. Again, I could have seen a scenario where Carlos Sainz eventually becomes a little bit of the number 2 there to Lando Norris just because he is the McLaren man. And then that's what's happened. He's gone to Ferrari. He's next to Charles Leclerc, who is Ferrari's star driver. And he hasn't put a foot wrong, in my opinion. I don't think Carlos Sainz has been incredibly poor throughout any of his races in Ferrari. He's gone through stints where things haven't gone quite right for him, don't get me wrong, but I think he's done everything to show that he should be right up there with some of the best drivers on the grid and have a team built around him. Whether that will happen in 2025, whether or not he'll be able to make a move to a Mercedes, to a Red Bull, we'll just have to wait and see. But moving on from that, Ferrari and Sainz, Fatima also said Lewis to Ferrari wasn't a great move. At his age, taking a driver, I don't know how logical it is. And you can look at this from 2 perspectives, right? I feel like you can look at it from Lewis Hamilton's perspective, and it's a massive up from him. Like, it really depends on whether or not you think Lewis Hamilton is going to be able to refine some of the pace that he has been missing over these last couple of seasons, really, once he enters that Ferrari seat. Because if we see Lewis back to his best in this Ferrari, I think we're going to see something a little bit special. The feeling around the team, and Fred Vasseur is kind of the pinnacle of this. It does feel like the Ferrari team is finally going somewhere at last. It feels like they're finally moving in a trajectory where realistically they could actually challenge. Because if you look at the last couple of seasons, 2022, 2023, the problems that Ferrari have faced have been sketchy tyre management. Like, they just haven't been able to hold onto the tyres during the races. They've shown they have clear pace in qualifying, but they haven't been able to really battle with the top teams and even hold the likes of McLaren and Mercedes at bay sometimes because of their tyre deg. They seem to have got that right in 2024. So far this season, in the 3 races that we've had, they look like they finally sorted that out. And their race execution, the pit stops at the right time, they're doing the right thing, they're having the right tyres on at the right time. It's been one of those things that Ferrari have continually got wrong over the course of the years, but it looks like they're finally getting somewhere. I think Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz have been massive in that and making them team move in the right direction, actually think about what they're doing and execute the weekends properly. And it feels like those 2 things were the big problems, and they've kind of been solved. Like, McLaren on Sunday was a threat, but they couldn't actually end up getting past Charles Leclerc and still were defeated. And even if Max Verstappen would have been in the Grand Prix for a little bit longer, I feel like the Red Bulls wasn't ridiculously quick in comparison to the Ferrari. You only have to look at Sergio Perez, who we'll talk about in a second, but Sergio Perez wasn't able to just fly by and get through the pack really, really quickly, I feel like there would have been an opportunity for Carlos Sainz or Charles Leclerc to really have a go at Max Verstappen this weekend. We didn't get to see it, but it does just feel like across the start of this season, and since the regulation changes, really, in my opinion, I know that Mercedes managed to get second place in the Constructors last year, but I feel like that was the race execution that I'm talking about with Ferrari, because actually, Ferrari have now clearly established themselves as the second best team on the grid, and the team that is by far and away the closest at catching Red Bull. And therefore, if you look at Lewis Hamilton in all of this, Lewis Hamilton has got to be what seemingly felt like a sideways move from Mercedes to Ferrari, because the Mercedes and Ferrari cars were very level pegging last year, is now looking like it will be a step up, and is now looking like it's going to put Lewis Hamilton in a better position to actually fight for race wins and race championships once again, because Mercedes is just nowhere right now, whereas Ferrari feel like they're flying. Because Formula Anything also said this is sadly going to be Hamilton's worst season ever. Worst season ever. And I was like, okay, is that exaggerating a little bit? And I was going back. Lewis Hamilton has been in the sport for a very long time, you have to remember. You know, all the way back to 2007 when he made his debut in the sport. But Mercedes, again, are leaving the Australian Grand Prix without adding anything to their points total and looking like they've probably had the worst weekend of the three, none of which have been good. Like Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and this weekend have all been pretty terrible for the team. And this one feels like the worst of the worst. Like, it's just getting worse and worse and worse for Mercedes over the course of this season. There was another... It felt like that familiar feeling again where they flattered in free practice. It looked like Lewis Hamilton might be okay. It looked like George Russell might be okay in free practice. And I don't know whether they are doing like glory runs or something. It seems silly to think that they might. But whenever it actually comes to a competitive session, all of that pace that they seem to have, or like all of the pace that Mercedes are showing in those free practice sessions, just seems to disappear. And in reality, Mercedes were once again probably further from the pace than they have been in a while. I can't remember a track like this where they've been so far off the back of not just Red Bull, but Ferrari were clearly quicker. There was the McLarens that were clearly quicker. Aston Martin were giving them a real headache. And it felt like the Mercedes was fourth, maybe even fifth fastest. We'll talk about the Alonso incident a little bit later on. And the reactions don't lie. Lewis Hamilton was livid after the Grand Prix. He has no faith in this Mercedes car moving forwards. And he actually said, this is the worst start of the season I've ever had. So going back to what Formula Anything said, I don't think it's an exaggeration. I think this could literally be the worst season from Lewis Hamilton that we ever see in his career, because I do think it's going to get better for him in Ferrari, and I do think the Ferrari car is going to offer him more if he can get a hold on that car. And he should do, because he's got a very similar driving style to Charles Leclerc. We know that Ferrari is going to move more towards Charles Leclerc towards the end of this season, because Carlos Sainz is leaving, and therefore there's no point in moving the fundamentals of that Ferrari car towards a driver that isn't going to be there any longer. And this weekend, where, you know, the fallen giants of Mercedes just get outdone by Ferrari with a convincing 1-2 from the Ferrari team as well, I don't know. Mercedes didn't look like it was any closer to finding a solution. It didn't feel like anything they changed, anything they did really put them in a better situation. And I know Lewis Hamilton ended up with an engine failure, and that's why he dropped out of the Grand Prix. But where would he have finished otherwise? 9th? Maybe 10th? Like, I feel like he'd have actually been in the mix. Probably would have been ahead of Tsunoda and the Haas's, but Lance Stroll maybe would have caused him a little bit of a headache. Definitely wouldn't have caught up to the likes of George Russell and Fernando Alonso, in my opinion. So it was absolutely dreadful once again from Mercedes. Moving on to McLaren, though, I feel like we have to look at the other side of the coin when it came to the teams that should be battling up there for the podium positions, especially when Max Verstappen and Red Bull don't have the best of weekends. And Cool Car Fine says McLaren need to stop swapping their drivers round because Piastri could have had a home podium. And on reflection, I thought this during the race. I was kind of a little bit disappointed, and I think Oscar Piastri will be disappointed to have to give up that place, especially at his home Grand Prix, where he is trying to be that #1 Australian driver moving forwards. We have to remember, Daniel Ricciardo is still the home favourite. Whether that will start to switch now because of the performances of those two drivers, possibly. And Oscar Piastri is trying to win round the crowd a little bit. So a home podium would have been sensational for him. But I can also understand the decision. And if you look at it, Lando Norris did have a lot more pace during those first couple of stints. And at one point, it did look like Lando Norris was in contention for second place. Charles Leclerc was having a really torrid time on that second stint during the race before his final pit stop. And Lando Norris was gaining and gaining and gaining, was within about a second and a half of Charles Leclerc. And when the Leclerc car pitted in front of him and came out just in front of Sergio Perez, I think the McLarens needed to react. I can understand why they didn't pit him straight away, because if you pit him straight away, he probably would have come out behind Sergio Perez and maybe even in the mix with Fernando Alonso. And Lando Norris didn't need that. He needed to be right behind Charles Leclerc to really have an opportunity, because the straight line speed isn't there in this McLaren. So he needed to be right underneath the Ferrari on better tyres if he was going to be able to get that overtaking opportunity. But Lando stayed out, and then Sergio Perez came in, and I was like, okay, Sergio Perez has opened that gap now. You should definitely be pitting. But Lando stayed out even more, and stayed out even more, and just lost pace with Charles Leclerc. And in the end, was nowhere really near the Ferrari, which then got me thinking, could McLaren have swapped them back? Obviously, Lando Norris swapped into third place very early on, and I think that was the issue. I don't think you can swap them back at the end when Lando Norris had been ahead for 30, 40 laps at that point. It was just too late. And he was also in front by a considerable margin. So the likelihood of Oscar Piastri being able to even catch up to Lando Norris if Lando Norris had started to slow down to an extent where maybe they could have swapped, it just didn't really make sense from a logistical point of view from McLaren. But I do think McLaren threw away an opportunity to fight Charles Leclerc today. I do think there was an opening there where if he would have got that little bit closer, Lando being way faster than Oscar, as Polish Eddie has said, maybe could have caught Charles Leclerc with the right decisions being made. And it felt like the McLaren team didn't quite know how to judge it overall. Moving to Max Verstappen, because we haven't actually mentioned him yet, and I do think we do need to mention Red Bull as such. Winner Loser said Max Verstappen mentioned that his brake disc was stuck on the whole time, which is very true. He started complaining about it literally from turn 1 of the Grand Prix, and yet pulled away a 0.9 second gap after one lap. The RB20 in Max's hands might be even better than we thought. And I think that last sentence really kind of poignant to me. The RB20 in Max's hands. Because let's talk about Verstappen. Verstappen's race of 3 laps was incredibly dramatic. You could see he was having issues literally from turn 1. That brake was stuck on, and it just meant it started heating up and heating up and heating up, and by lap 3 had completely overheated, shredded the carbon fiber, set itself on fire and exploded. And there was nothing that Max Verstappen could really do about that. It was a quite simple failure, and the sort of thing that we don't really expect from Red Bull, because they have just been so bulletproof in the last couple of seasons. But the brake failure, incredibly dramatic, really did throw a spanner in the works. And when Max Verstappen broke down, it was like, okay, there's still Sergio Perez though, and I was a little bit worried that we'd just see Sergio Perez take the victory here, because we've seen over the past couple of races, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Sergio Perez has been that second best competitor to Max Verstappen and has been able to deliver when he's needed to. Coming into Australia though, Sergio Perez was nowhere near picking up the pieces. I know he got that 3-place penalty, which definitely took him backwards in terms of where he could have been, because he ended up stuck behind George Russell for a little while in the early part of the race, which just got killed his strategy. And even with that though, the aero that you've got underneath you, the RB20 car that you've got underneath you, I was expecting a little bit more from Sergio Perez. He did apparently have a visor tear off that was underneath his car, like lodged in the actual underside aerodynamics of the car. How much that affected his race, only Red Bull will really know. But at the same time, I was expecting a bit more. And even Christian Horner after the race was a little bit 50-50 on Sergio Perez. I think he appreciated that Sergio Perez still put in a decent performance, managed to pick up some points where Max Verstappen couldn't, and obviously the team still need those points in the Constructors' Championship. Will they need them by the end of the season? Maybe not, but at this point it still sticks them top of the table. However, when it came to that, and when it came to the fact, Sergio Perez wasn't there to deny Carlos Sainz that victory, Red Bull knows that Sergio Perez effectively didn't fulfill what he's hired to do in Australia. He does need to be there. And it was the first time we haven't seen Sergio Perez on the podium this year as well. And although he's had really good races in Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, I don't think he can afford many more of these races where he just doesn't really fulfill what you're expecting in that RB20. Because as Winner Loser has said, in the hands of Max Verstappen, even with a brake failure, he was holding on to the lead of the Grand Prix. So he is absolutely flying at this point in the season as Max Verstappen. He is still the most informed driver on the grid. And this was just an unfortunate circumstance for Max Verstappen to find himself in 3 races into the season. Although it's been a long time since we've seen a Max Verstappen DNF. So I don't think he'll lose too much sleep over it. And I still think he's definitely, the front runner to win the championship by a considerable margin at this point. As we talk about Sergio Perez, though, and the Red Bull second seat, I've talked about Carlos Sainz and how good Carlos Sainz has been this season. Another option that Red Bull have got is this man, Yuki Tsunoda. Ain't no way, I assume it's supposed to be ain't no way, says Yuki Tsunoda looks strong, could get more points finishes than we think. And I think for the second race weekend in a row, Yuki Tsunoda, best of the rest, getting the RB into Q3, out-qualifying the Aston Martins in Australia. He's done nothing wrong. He's absolutely smashing it so far this season is Yuki Tsunoda. And you guys know, if you've been around the channel for a little while, I do have a soft spot for Yuki Tsunoda. I'm not sure what it is. There's just something about him that I just want to support him and make sure that he gets the best opportunities possible. Just really like Yuki Tsunoda. And I think this weekend was the perfect opportunity to show what he was really going for and what he can really do in this RB car. Because unlike Jeddah, where he was able to still qualify in Q3, this weekend he properly made it count. And Yuki Tsunoda has had such a strong opening to this Grand Prix and this season that actually you look at it, he was keeping in touch with Lance Stroll, created a nice margin behind so that the likes of Albon and so on were within arm's distance. They were, not really causing Yuki Tsunoda any kind of problems. Even at the end of the Grand Prix with Hülkenberg and Magnussen finishing behind, they were still a considerable margin behind Yuki Tsunoda at that point. And okay, you can look at it from both perspectives, right? You can say Yuki Tsunoda was keeping up with the Aston Martins, but without the retirements of Verstappen, of the Mercedes cars, and Fernando Alonso picking up that penalty, it would have been 11th place rather than a 7th place finish. Fair enough. But given the gap between the top 5 teams and the bottom 5 teams, the only way anyone is picking up some points, especially in those bottom 5 teams, is when something goes wrong for the teams at the top. And it was Yuki Tsunoda who capitalized the most. It was Yuki Tsunoda who picked up 6 points for his team. And that is absolutely huge for RB moving forwards. And Tsunoda has just impressed massively at the start of 2024. However, he did do the same last year. I remember going into Monaco last year and really hyping up Yuki Tsunoda. I maybe even made a video where I was really going for Yuki Tsunoda and I was like, this is it. This Yuki Tsunoda season, 2023 is going to be the one. And then it slowed down a touch. I'm hoping that this year it doesn't slow down a touch. Although we'll have to give it another 5 races and we'll see where Yuki Tsunoda is. But at the minute, there's very little to pick apart in terms of Yuki Tsunoda's performances. I think the only thing that's been a blemish on his season so far is that incident at the end of the Bahrain Grand Prix. But in terms of his actual on-track racing, he has been sublime, which is not something you can say about his teammate. Colby Ellis says, Daniel Ricciardo gets released mid-season for Liam Lawson, RB/AlphaTauri, however you want to call it, doing it once again, sacking their established, more experienced driver halfway through a season. Could it happen in back-to-back years? We'll have to wait and see. But on this form, there's no reason for him to be in the conversation. For those Red Bull seats that he's talking about in the Drive to Survive documentary, absolutely not. Is he going to replace Sergio Perez? No, he is nowhere near a Red Bull racing seat in 2025. And at this point in his career, because he is so much older at this point and has been around for a considerable amount of time, if he's not heading in that direction, there's no need for him to be in that RB seat. Like, what are RB actually getting from Daniel Ricciardo at this point? I was actually quite positive about Daniel Ricciardo staying at RB. I was hoping that this season he was going to really kick on and kind of be the driver that the team could build a little bit around, establish themselves around. But at this point, Yuki Tsunoda is that. Yuki Tsunoda is clearly the driver that this team should be looking at and building around for the future, and should definitely be trying to get more out of, because he is by far and away, well, as I said, he's been best of the rest in 2 of the 3 Grand Prix. Daniel Ricciardo has been nowhere near best of the rest in 2 of the 3 Grand Prix, not even close to best of the rest like in any of the Grand Prix. I'd say the only performance I've been really positive about Daniel Ricciardo in the last 2 years, and I know that he only raced 7 times last year, but is that Mexican Grand Prix. That's all he's got that is saving his name right now. And I know he did have a deleted qualifying lap, but again, that's his fault for breaking track limits. And even with that, there was a clear deficit to Yuki Tsunoda, wasn't there? And he needed to come into this season and emphatically be the number 1 at RB and show that he was leading the team to get back into the caliber of car that he wants. For me, I know I made this a video about Daniel Ricciardo and his situation just before the Australian Grand Prix, and I thought this weekend was going to be the turning point. I feel like the Australian Grand Prix, for me, Daniel Ricciardo was either gonna absolutely fly and use the fact that it was home Grand Prix, somewhere he knows incredibly well, back on the Formula 1 grid for his home Grand Prix again, and it just didn't happen. And it's starting to get into that spiral now, isn't it? It's 3 races down, 21 to go, which is a considerable amount of races, but what can Daniel Ricciardo actually do to change his fate? Like, because he needs to find himself and find pace in this car pretty quickly. Otherwise, he is going to be running out of time. And we've seen it quite a lot where Daniel Ricciardo and, well, just drivers in the past. We saw this with him at McLaren, where you do run out of time very quickly in Formula 1. You are only as good as your last few performances. And Daniel Ricciardo's last few performances have been pretty dire. Aston Martin, let's talk about them. They rounded out the points. Well, actually, we'll talk about Haas as well. Aston Martin were in the points once again, and you'd feel like it should be a positive weekend for Aston Martin. Both cars in the points again, obviously after Lance Stroll had that DNF last time out. But I feel like you come away from this and Fernando Alonso, there's a little bit of controversy to talk about here. The Spaniard, you know, the most experienced driver on the grid, and currently one of the drivers without any penalty points on his license, comes away from this weekend 3 points on his license, and quite a contentious issue. And it's whether or not you kind of stand on the Alonso side of things, stand on the steward side of things. Like, regardless of whether you believe Alonso or George Russell, the braking into turn 6 on the penultimate lap of the Grand Prix was awful. And if you haven't seen this, because it did only come out quite a little while after the Grand Prix had finished, Fernando Alonso was summoned to the stewards with George Russell because of that incident and the final lap, penultimate lap, where George Russell was following the Aston Martin down towards turn 6 and then suddenly just seemed to lose any kind of downforce, couldn't get the car to stop, and ended up sideways on the track and almost upside down. Fernando Alonso, looking back at the telemetry, the steward's verdict is that it was called an extraordinary maneuver. And I don't want to get this wrong because it's so contentious. It's one of those, again, kind of grey areas in motorsport where it's like, okay, Fernando Alonso is defending the corner. And Fernando Alonso has said that he was simply trying a different line into the corner so that he could carry a bit more pace down towards the overtaking opportunity so that he could put up more of a defense to the Mercedes car that was behind. And okay, you can understand that. But if you actually look at the telemetry of the car, into turn 6, where he braked, was over 100 meters earlier than previously. So Fernando Alonso brakes 100 meters before he would usually brake for that corner. And he said that that was just a misjudgment. And okay, yep, you can misjudge that, but 100 meters, I know they're going very, very quickly, but 100 meters, trust me, to these Formula 1 drivers is a lot. You usually see drivers brake within the same 2 or 3 meter gap for every single corner across the entire Grand Prix. They are robotic in their understanding of the racing line and where is best to brake. But he said it was a clear misjudgment. However, to do so, to brake that early, to close the gap to the car behind like that, I feel like the stewards made a good point. It feels reckless. Whatever your reasoning is, and obviously Fernando Alonso is going to plead innocent in all of this, whatever that reasoning is, it does feel like he was causing a safety issue. Does feel like he was causing a safety issue, in my opinion. Russell, for me, just, okay, he has also misjudged it as well. And this is the thing. George Russell has also made a mistake. But Fernando Alonso has kind of instigated a lot of that mistake being made. And it's a real grey area. It's a real grey area. I feel like, for me, I can't defend Fernando Alonso in this. Yeah, I'm the same as Alvaro. I just can't quite actually find a way. 100 meters is not a lot if you plan on getting the battery. I suppose... But when it was 100, when you look at 56 laps or whatever it was, and Fernando Alonso's braked at pretty much the same point every single lap, and then it's 100 meters earlier, it just felt a little bit off to me. And obviously, it's cost Fernando Alonso 4 points. He ended up with a 20-second penalty. It doesn't cost Aston Martin too much because his teammate Lance Stroll was the car just behind him. So Lance Stroll actually moves up a position, picks up 6th place. So the team only lost 2 points, and that 2 points ended up in the hands of Yuki Tsunoda in the RB. And I know that actually, in the grand scheme of things, is that 2 points going to make a difference? Not really. Aston Martin look like they are clearly the 5th fastest team. Is that 2 points going to cost them 4th place to a McLaren or a Mercedes? Definitely not. Is that 2 points going to drop them to 6th place behind an RB or a Haas? No. So the gap between the top 5 teams and the bottom 5 teams is just so stark at this point that 2 points dropped actually doesn't mean anything. But it's just a little bit of a... Fernando Alonso, that was a bit sketchy from him, and I feel like we need to keep an eye on that kind of thing. I don't want that kind of thing to be happening more often, especially in these tighter battles, because that just ruins, effectively, what is the most exciting part of the sport, which is 2 drivers getting very, very close on slightly different strategies and racing one another wheel to wheel. We didn't get to see that because... I think Fernando Alonso was trying to be a little bit wily, to try and brake a little bit earlier, but braking 100 meters earlier is a bit too much, in my opinion. But there we are. Finally, Haas rounded out the points. I think Ishan here has nailed it. Haas has a good team with an average car. And I think, that's a fair statement for Haas so far this season. And the Io Komatsu era of this Haas Formula 1 team is starting off pretty strong. Like, it's their first double points finish in a considerable amount of time. I want to say midway through 2022, they managed to get one with Mick Schumacher and Kevin Magnussen, but I can't remember one last year. And this year, most certainly not. Like, they are absolutely smashing it in terms of picking up points early on and completely sort of ruining everyone's predictions for the 2024 season. Okay, Yuki Tsunoda won the best of the rest fight. I think Yuki Tsunoda is still that best of the rest driver out of those kind of bottom 10 drivers that we have on the grid. But to secure 3 really valuable points and be the first of the bottom 5 teams to have both of their cars in the points, that is very, very impressive from the Haas team. And I think what we're seeing from Haas is they still have that qualifying pace that they had last year. They can still put their car in a really solid starting position. And that is so crucial because even though they're not having, scintillatingly fast race pace, a lot of the time they're able to get the strategy right. They're able to start in a good position. And that's all you really need to do. Then you just have to hope that Max Verstappen, Lewis Hamilton, they drop out of the race and you're able to just jump up into the points because there is a gap left by those drivers. And you look at the fact that both drivers really worked well together. Once again, I feel like Kevin Magnussen and Nico Hülkenberg, they work for the best of the team. I feel like they're the most harmonious team right now. We don't see any real qualms with them swapping positions. They swap positions multiple times. We had Kevin Magnussen last weekend literally complete a suicide mission for his race to secure some points for Nico Hülkenberg. Again, this time around, Nico Hülkenberg was the faster driver and Kevin Magnussen let him through. They are completely proving everyone wrong and just really, really impressed with Haas. I don't even know if I've got the word for it. Just so impressed by the Haas team and what they're doing right now. I've gone the wrong way. Williams. Finished just outside the points. Alex Albon finishing in 11th place. But Dane says this is karma for Williams for not giving Logan Sargent a chance because Williams didn't get points. They should give him every opportunity they could do from him. I think that's slightly weirdly worded at the end, but I completely understand the point. It did feel like Williams needed to get points this weekend after a very controversial start to the weekend. And Williams and Alex Albon taking a point away from the Australian Grand Prix would have certainly softened the blow to Logan Sargent, who, on Friday night, through no fault of his own, was told, you're not going to be racing this weekend because the other driver in the other car has smashed up his Williams, not yours, but we're going to take your car off of you and give it to effectively our favourite driver, the driver that is more likely to pick up points. And it's just tricky. Just tricky to swallow, I guess, if you're Logan Sargent. That opportunity, another race that's just been taken away from him. And that's a really good point, Peter. Logan isn't scoring points, but it does feel like he was punished for something that he didn't do. And then when the team didn't pick up the points, it's quite a bitter pill to swallow. It simply wasn't to be for Alex Albon. He finished in 11th place, but he just couldn't keep pace with the Haas drivers. And unlike in Jeddah, it wasn't, Kevin Magnussen pulling out all the stops and pulling out some weird defensive maneuvers to keep Alex Albon behind. This was the true pace of the Williams, and it wasn't at the level of either of the Haas cars this weekend. So they just had a slower race car, 6 lap older tyres, was it, by the end of the Grand Prix? Because Alex Albon was having to pit early. The tyre degradation from the Williams was horrendous. I think the early pit stops, I think Alex Albon said, kind of disguised the actual just lack of pace within that car. And the race pace that they had, any attempt to run at the same pace of the cars in front, just fell apart. Just absolutely fell apart. Oh, thank you so much. I think Lewis is kind of overrated. Massa deserved 2008. What a absolute flyer of a question. We'll get to that maybe at the end. But thank you so much for the donation. Where was I? Williams. Ultimately, the Australian Grand Prix was clearly a big missed opportunity for the Williams team. It felt like this weekend should have been one of the ones where they were battling for points. But I don't know. I can understand, as you say, like everyone in the chat's now saying, London is red is also saying the same thing. I also get it from Williams' point of view. Would Logan Sargent have done better? It seems very unlikely that Logan Sargent would have had a better race than Alex Albon. But the whole situation, it just feels like it's going to be continually discussed. It's going to be one of those talking points that keeps coming up. And especially as the pressure kind of builds on Logan Sargent towards the end of this year, and especially because we're looking at a very, very close battle between those back five teams, it just feels like this is going to be one of those things that is continually brought up and they're questioned about and they have to keep answering questions about. And we know that that kind of thing can really start to hurt a team dynamic. And now you're looking at the fact that maybe in a few races' time, Williams are looking like they might pick up some points. Is Logan Sargent going to, continue to be that perfect teammate to Alex Albon? We'll have to wait and see, but it's going to be interesting. Let's talk about steak, because we're getting towards the back end of the pack now, aren't we? Knight756 says, filet mignon, meaning steak, Formula One team, pit stops are very bad. I think that's an understatement. They destroyed Joe at the pits, and Bottas had an almost 4-second pit stop. It's getting beyond a joke now, isn't it? It's getting beyond a joke and beyond embarrassing for the stake Formula One team at this point in the season. Like, the problem that they've got, okay, let's actually kind of strip this back all the way at the beginning of the season. Even in testing, they had an issue where when they were putting the wheel gun in, the cross-threading that they have wasn't actually allowing them to rotate the wheel nut fully, and the wheel nut was effectively just getting stuck. And if you keep going, you'll eventually just shed all of the actual grip, and you end up with a wheel that is never coming off. Think Valtteri Bottas back at Monaco, where they put on the tyre gun, they shredded off any of the actual attachment on the tyre, and then they had to wait until Bottas's car was all the way back at the Mercedes factory before they could get that wheel off. That's what they don't want to do. And that's an issue that they've been having. Basically, the wheel gun just isn't lining up, and the cross-threading is causing it to just absolutely decimate the tyre. Now, this is something that if you noticed it at the first race of the season, the first Grand Prix, even in testing, they've had this issue. If it's something that you notice, that should be a real thing that is fixed instantly. Because now, Sauber still haven't fixed it. We've wasted 3 races of the season, in which all 3 races have been ruined by slow pit stops. Like, Valtteri Bottas was kind of in contention in Bahrain, awful pit stop. Zhou Guanyu, similar in Saudi Arabia, terrible pit stop. And now, both drivers this weekend had atrocious pit stops because the team decided to find a solution that isn't really a solution. So the solution was that on race day, the stops would be, instead of being good, would be okay. They'd be okay enough, which meant the team was super cautious in their pit stops. And the argument from the team was, okay, we're not going to have 2.5-second stops like the majority of other teams. We'll maybe have, as we said here, 4-second pit stops, which doesn't seem like a lot. They're losing a second or so. It ended up being more like 5-6 seconds, some of these pit stops, but it's better than having a 30-second pit stop, a 40-second pit stop. And that is true. It is still better, but over the course of a race, it really made no difference. It still left Valtteri Bottas and Zhou Guanyu in a complete no man's land, and they just had no chance of even battling for where they really should have been, because it just doesn't make sense to me. It just doesn't make sense to me that they can have this issue and not find a solution that is not, well, we're just going to have slow pit stops. That's their solution. Instead of having terrible pit stops, we'll just have bad pit stops. That's not a solution. You need to have pit stops that are aligning yourself with the other teams, because if they want to get competitive and they actually want to be in the mix with those 5 teams at the back of the pack, outside of Alpine, who are absolutely falling apart at this point, the problem that they have had is easily their pit stops. And it seems like such a simple solution, right? Just fix the threading on the tyres and the guns that you have. Copy what everyone else is doing with their tyre threading. Like, that is not a protected part, I don't think, in Formula 1. It would be a bit weird if it was a protected part. Just literally go and look at someone else's, copy that, fix yours. Because it's just stupid at stake, just completely stupid. And then rounding out, one I want to kind of throw to the chat a little bit, and I know there's a few discussions going on. Carlos Sainz avoiding driving for stake next year, I think, needs to be talked about as well. They're not really going in the right direction. Whether they will when they're Audi is another question. But I want to throw this towards you, because Priceless Smile, or Priceless Mile, is throwing out that even with Max not winning, it doesn't mean the race is automatically better or more entertaining. The biggest problem is the first 2 races, and I would argue this race, has seen barely any close racing in the top 10. And okay, we've seen a few overtakes here and there. But really, I kind of agree with this. The top 10 just isn't much of a battleground at this point. We're looking at 3 races so far this season where whoever has started on pole has won. Because, you know, you're looking at effectively Carlos Sainz being basically pole because Max Verstappen drops out of the Grand Prix. So, we're then looking at, the Ferraris being behind. Was there any real battle with Charles Leclerc? No. There could have been a battle with Lando Norris? Maybe, but it was a very maybe. Was Sergio Perez able to close the gap and kind of scythe through the field? No. Was there any real battle between Alonso and Russell? Not really, because of the incident. So we didn't even get to see an overtake. We just saw Russell we saw Russell smash over the barriers and through the gravel. Was there any battle with Yuki Tsunoda? Not really. Just hung onto the back of Lance Stroll for as long as he possibly could and just kept going. Was there any battle towards the back of the pack? Kevin Magnussen did a really, really good overtake. We didn't see on the actual televised stuff. You want to look it up. It's a really, really incredible overtake from Kevin Magnussen as he was making his way through the field. But then you're looking at 10th place being the most entertaining of the entire Grand Prix. And I would argue that the same was said in Saudi Arabia. 10th place, Nico Hülkenberg, was the most entertaining drive. Maybe you could argue Ollie Behrman, but that was only because he was a rookie in a Ferrari. It was a very interesting story. I don't know. It was just... It does feel like the beginning of this season, the cars are in a very clear hierarchy at this moment. There seems to be a very obvious first, second, third, fourth, fifth. And when there is a very clear and obvious sort of top 5 in a specific order, we're looking at Red Bull, Ferrari, McLaren, Mercedes, Aston Martin in that order. There's no fighting between them because they eventually shuffle out to that order. They eventually find themselves with the Ferraris just behind the Red Bull of Max Verstappen. Then you have the McLarens. Then you have the Aston Martins, all the Mercedes. And then you maybe have someone sneak in. I don't know. I feel like it's one of those things that we do need to touch upon and we do need to think about. Then we have Max Verstappen still leading the championship. Just a little roundup of the Drivers' Championship so far. I think the biggest jump there is Yuki Tsunoda up in 11th place. 6 points. Matched Ollie Behrman in a Ferrari, by the way. Gets 6 points as well. But up there in 11th spot. Nico Hülkenberg also with a double points finishes to his name. 2 out of 3 races he's managed to pick up points. 3 points in his favour. Kevin Magnussen with 1 point has put him up there. All of the drivers behind on 0, Albon, Joe, Ricciardo, Ocon, Gasly, Bottas, Sargent, all still on 0 points so far this season. We've got Charles Leclerc, the closest competitor to Max Verstappen. Have to remember though, Carlos Sainz did miss the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix. It does make you wonder, would Carlos Sainz be ahead of Charles Leclerc there? I think so. I think Carlos Sainz would have probably finished 3rd or 4th in Saudi Arabia, depending on the battle between him and Charles Leclerc. So it'd be interesting to see how that kind of plays out. Sergio Perez finds himself off of 2nd place in the standings after 2 back-to-back 2nd place finishes. A drop to 5th just drops you all the way down to 3rd in the championship by a point. Don't know if that will stay like that. I think Sergio Perez is still the obvious choice to go into 2nd place in the driver's standings over the course of an entire season. You've got Oscar Piastri still a point ahead of Lando Norris. Going to be very tight between those 2 McLaren drivers, in my opinion. George Russell stays 7th on 18 points. Obviously, wouldn't have been too many points gained from George Russell, but would have stayed a little bit further ahead of Fernando Alonso, who ended up with 16 points after the end of this race. Then a little bit of a gap, 7 points to Lance Stroll. Lewis Hamilton is in 10th place, though. And the fact that, it's just going to be, I feel like it's already kind of shuffling into an order. Does feel like this order is going to be what happens towards the end of the season. Red Bull, 97 points, top of the tree, even with Max Verstappen having a DNF. Ferrari in 2nd place. Again, if Ollie Behrman hadn't taken the place of Carlos Sainz, maybe Ferrari would now be leading the Constructors' Championship, which would be interesting. Again, I don't think something that they'd been able to hold on to for the entire season. McLaren in 3rd place. Does feel like they'll end up there because Mercedes are so far adrift when it comes to the races that actually suit the McLaren car. I think the McLaren and Mercedes cars are very close to one another on the tracks that don't suit the McLaren, but the McLaren is very peaky, right? If it can get on the right track, it delivers. And they managed to get 3rd and 4th place this time around. So McLaren having a really good weekend. Mercedes obviously not picking up any points this weekend. Aston Martin just 1 point behind Mercedes. And I think Aston Martin have effectively guaranteed themselves 5th. I don't know if any of the back market teams are going to be able to pick up 25 points over the course of the season, let alone be able to swing the 19-point gap. Even more. No, it is 19, 25 and 6, 19-point gap that is there. And then Red Bull, RB, RB, 6 points, 6th place. Haas, 4 points in 7th place. I think 4 points is a big amount of points because it's not going to be every weekend where Verstappen and Hamilton and George Russell all don't finish the Grand Prix. Like 3 of the top 10 not finishing the Grand Prix is a big amount. And don't think we're going to see that again, maybe even again this season. You know, you look at the reliability of these cars in modern Formula One, will not happen much. So I think RB and Haas have put themselves in a really, really solid situation. I think it's going to be very, very tough for Williams or Stake or Alpine to get anywhere close to 6 points, let alone the 25 of Aston Martin. But that is the 3rd Grand Prix of 2024 over and done with. Felt like the first time in a long time that the Red Bull has looked human. The first DNF for Max Verstappen in a couple of years now. So we have actually seen that there is not a robot under the helmet of Max Verstappen, or at least not a robot in the Red Bull car. It does have its weaknesses. It can have reliability issues, and it did in this time around. But it does feel like as the year progresses, there are a lot of storylines starting to emerge. Carlos Sainz, where will his seat be next year? That seat search continues. The fall of Mercedes and whether or not they're actually going to be competitive anytime soon, looking less and less likely. The RB situation of Tsunoda, Ricciardo, that 2nd Red Bull seat, whether or not that's going to go in either of their favour or whether Red Bull just stick with Sergio Perez. Do they go somewhere else? The back of the pack fight and the fact that Haas are fully proving everybody, all of the doubters, completely and utterly wrong. There are a lot of storylines that are starting to develop. And don't get me wrong, it was incredibly nice to see Carlos Sainz get a win. He is one of my favourite drivers on the Formula One grid. Again, I still have a little place in my heart for him, for his time at McLaren. I really enjoyed the Car-Lando relationship when they were there together and I could watch that. But it would have been nicer if it was just a little bit more competitive. If Carlos Sainz would have had to work for it just a little bit more. But there it is. Start of the season, there's a very clear hierarchy, isn't there? Top 5, bottom 5 teams. Tsunoda and Hülkenberg probably the standout performers in this one for me, just in that back of the pack. Maybe K-Mag too, obviously picked up a performance. But it does look like it's those top 5 teams, Yuki Tsunoda, Nico Hülkenberg, and they're the two that are going to be able to, sneak into the points whenever there is a problem for one of those top 5 teams. But I'd love to know your thoughts. Thank you to everybody who watched this live. I appreciate that massively. Thank you to all the subscriptions, the super chats as well. Appreciate all of you stopping by and watching the streams. We will be back live once again for the Japanese Grand Prix in a couple of weeks' time. We're live for the race, for the qualifying, and of course for the hot takes of round 4 for the 2024 season